All right, it looks like we have attendees joining. We're going to give folks a couple more minutes to jump on, and then I'll do an introduction and we will begin the webinar for this evening with Dr. Nicole Telfer, Annie Garner, and Kira Banks. All right, well, let's get started. It is a little after 4:30. I'm going to do a quick introduction, like I said, and then we'll get going on the content, the important content for this evening. So, hello and welcome, everyone. Happy National Children's Mental Health Awareness Day for 2023, May 11th. To commemorate this day, the Integrated Behavioral Health Fellowship Program at St. Louis University is hosting today's webinar. Where do we go from here? Effects of racism on child development. The Integrated Behavioral Health Fellowship Program is a federally funded clinical education program dedicated to the training of the next generation of anti-racist and LGBTQ affirming healthcare providers across 4 disciplines: clinical psychology, psychiatry, social work, and marriage and family therapy. This webinar is our chance to share this education with the St. Louis region. I'm going to introduce our esteemed webinar panel guests, and then we'll have a webinar presentation by Dr. Telfer and some Q&A with Drs. Kira Banks and Annie Garner. All right, Dr. Nicole Telfer is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at UNC-Chapel Hill, an intern at the University of Maryland Medical Center's Pediatric Unit, a trainee at Georgetown's Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities Program, and a trainer and consultant for the Color of Autism Foundation based in Detroit, Michigan. I don't know when you sleep, Nicole, but I am thrilled to have you here. She's deeply committed to improving the lives of racial and ethnic minoritized children and adolescents through research and practice. Her work is grounded in the theory of intersectionality and the influence of sociocultural factors on racial and ethnic minoritized youth development. Our other panel guest is Dr. Kira Banks, co-founder of the Institute of Healing Justice at St. Louis University, where she is a professor of psychology. She has served as racial equity consultant for the Ferguson Commission and continued as the racial equity catalyst for Forward Through Ferguson. Her research, teaching, and facilitation through equity, diversity, and inclusion have helped frame racial equity in the St. Louis region and beyond. And then we have Dr. Annie Garner, an associate professor of psychology at St. Louis University. Her work specialized in neurodiversity and ADHD. Her groundbreaking research on a novel intervention that reduces the risk of car accidents for young people with ADHD was recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine. She's also a co-investigator and faculty lead in the Integrated Behavioral Health Fellowship Program here at SLU. So we'll begin our presentation next. Feel free to put Q&A questions. You'll see them on the bottom of your screen there on Zoom. You can vote up questions you'd like to see answered, but we are going to let Drs. Banks and Garner curate that Q&A section. So I'll turn things over to Dr. Telfer. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Let me just play from the start. All right, thank you for the lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. And it's an honor to be here in honor of National Children's Mental Health Awareness Day. And so today we'll be talking about the effects of racism on child development. And so I'll be sharing on a range of topics today. So I thought a presentation overview might be helpful. So we'll talk about racism, the domains of child development, racism in the early years. We'll talk about the impact of racism and COVID-19, a conceptual model, the 3 Ps of promoting, preserving, and protecting children's development, and then some policy, research, and practical implications. So this presentation is informed by an article that I co-authored with other brilliant scholars in the field. And in this article, we developed a conceptual framework called RISE, or R to the third power. So Racism, Resilience, and Resistance, Integrative Study of Childhood Ecosystem, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But I just wanted to provide the title so that you all can see the title of the paper. And I'm also happy to provide access to anyone who is unable to have a PDF copy of it. So I want to start by sharing some domains of child development. There are many domains, but I just focus on 4 here for the sake of time. And these are also general descriptions, so they're not entirely reflective of cultural differences or children with disabilities. And so cognitive development is the idea that children learn through exploration and imagination. They gain the ability to process thoughts, they pay attention, develop memory, and also express creativity. And during social emotional development, children are gaining confidence, they're gaining social skills and independence. Children are also learning how to regulate their emotions, so maybe learning how to cope with challenging situations. Physical development includes the ability to balance and gain strength. It also includes the enhancement of fine motor skills, like maybe learning how to button up their buttons or using utensils, or gross motor skills, like learning how to ride a bike. And then there's language development, which involves the ability, children's ability to communicate with others. So that some aspects of language includes phonology, pragmatics, semantics, and syntax. And so now that we've looked at some of the domains of child development, let's talk about the impact of racism on these domains, just to get us started on this topic. So, maybe consider this the appetizer. And so racism affects the cognitive outcomes of racially and ethnic minoritized children, and I'll refer to them as REM moving forward. And so although this social cognitive model under the cognitive outcomes box was created quite some time ago, I think it's still relevant and important to be made aware of, because children are still learning how to process and think about information. And so the way that they process racist related information influences their perception of themselves, of their behaviors, and also their health. Racism also impacts social emotional outcomes of children. And so REM children who experience racism are at higher risk for emotional and behavioral difficulties. And they may also present hyperactive behavior, so maybe lack of attention and also conduct problems. It's also important to pay attention to the social emotional differences of REM children with disabilities. For example, autistic children tend to display differences in the way that they communicate and socialize with others. So when we think of Black autistic children who may become dysregulated as a result of a triggering or racist event, they may be labeled as non-compliant, as defiant, disruptive, and then ultimately criminalized. Children's physical outcomes and development is also impacted by racism. So we know that play is a necessary component of physical development because children are learning how to move and run and balance through play. But unfortunately, play among Black children has been repeatedly criminalized by society that often deems Black and brown children as dangerous and suspicious. And so we can think of 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was killed by 2 police officers in Ohio for playing with a toy gun in a public park. And Tamir was mistaken for a 21-year-old adult male and perceived as a threat by nearby citizens. And so there's a lot of research on this school playground to prison pipeline, which includes the surveillance of Black children and consequences as a result of them just simply existing. And then children's language outcomes are also impacted. For example, the vocabulary language gap among REM children versus white children. And so young children from low SES backgrounds have been found to have significantly lower vocabulary scores than young children from high SES backgrounds. And children from REM backgrounds are often coming from these low SES households. And so racism also impacts other aspects of the lives of REM children and their families. And specifically, it impacts their economic stability and security. And so Black, Latin, and Indigenous children are more likely to live in poverty than white and Asian children. Also, white families are more likely to have 8 to 10 times greater wealth than Latin and Black families. And so I was at a conference about 4 weeks ago where I just learned a little bit more about the Black-white racial wealth gap. And I learned that for every $100 that a white family holds in wealth, a Black family holds about $5 and some change. So we know that's a problem. Racism also impacts the neighborhood and community environment. And so it's important to note that there is a connection between economic stability and the neighborhood environment. And so children who live in poverty are likely to live in neighborhoods and housing that is in poor condition. And because of this, they are likely to be exposed to environmental toxins like air pollution and noise pollution as well, and also lead poisoning. And Black and Latin children are vulnerable to this. The birth outcomes of REM children and the health and well-being of REM birthing parents or the mom are also important to talk about. And so women of color have higher shares of preterm births, low birth weight births, and are less likely to receive late or more likely to receive late or no prenatal care compared to white women. And let's not forget about the maternal mortality and how maternal death rates during COVID-19 has increased and the racial disparities even widened for Black women. Racism also affects the educational opportunities of REM children. Black boys are 2.5 times more likely than their white peers to be suspended for the same behavioral difficulties. Also, while Black children represent just 18% of the preschool population and preschool enrollment, they make up almost half of preschool children receiving 1 or more out-of-school suspension. And this finding speaks to the preschool to prison pipeline. And so when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, there is a group of students that often goes unnoticed, and those are students with disabilities. And so students with disabilities have higher rates of suspension and expulsions than students without disabilities. They are often labeled as bad or troubled children and are hardly ever given the resources needed to support their needs in the education system. And young students with disabilities tend to experience what is called soft suspensions and expulsions. And this is when teachers are constantly calling the parents and asking them to pick them up from school, or if they're disciplining the child by sending them out of the classroom when they are dysregulated. And according to the National Council on Disability, about 85% of incarcerated youth have a disability, but just 37% of them receive special education services in school. And not surprisingly, Black students with disabilities are more likely to be given exclusionary measures as consequences for behavior infractions. They are also more likely than any of their peers to receive special education services for emotional disturbance. And so COVID-19 greatly impacted the outcomes and needs of children with disabilities. They experienced a loss of home nursing, therapy, education supports, and safe access to medical care. School closures specifically led to a loss of a multitude of supports like therapies for speech and learning, and also a predictable routine for and for students with disabilities. A predictable routine often helps them thrive in educational settings. And so the pandemic did shed light on the disparities that exist among REM children with disabilities and REM children in general. And so we were able to see who truly had access to quality and adequate resources and who did not. And so honing in on how both racism and COVID-19 impacted the lives of Black children and families, I want to briefly move into some findings on the health outcomes and well-being of Black children during the pandemic from the Black Parent Voices data, which were collected in 2020. And so this project was funded by the RISER Network, which stands for Researchers Investigating Sociocultural Equity and Race. And I was a pre-doctoral fellow here as well. And so researchers were interested in understanding Black families' experiences of racism and discrimination prior to and during the pandemic. And so one of the main findings from this report was that Black children and their families were significantly impacted by the effects of racism during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this slide includes a summary of main takeaway points for financial security. And so broadly, Black families were experiencing extreme poverty, extreme economic instability. And during the pandemic, half of all Black families reported a decrease in their income. And to add to that, over 40% of Black families below or near the poverty line experienced financial burden, even after they received the stimulus checks. And so moving on to children's healthcare and well-being, I want to say that both parents and children's emotional well-being were suffering, but for the sake of time, I just included a slide on children's health. And so almost a third of Black parents reported their child missing a checkup during the pandemic, and their primary concern was being exposed to the virus. And as shown in this graph, from pre-pandemic up until week 33, children have become more fussy or defiant and also fearful or anxious. And so here are some qualitative responses because it is important to give voice to these data points. I'll go ahead and read one aloud for you. So one Black parent said, racism, the historical and contemporary trauma and grief that is occurring is overwhelming. Add that on top of a pandemic when I cannot use regular outlets to center myself, gym, hang out with friends, etc. It is exhausting. And so these were just a few findings from a very thorough report that can be found online. And again, along with any other resources, I'm happy to share this report with attendees. All right, let's talk about this conceptual model that we developed called RISE. And so the RISE model is an integration of multiple frameworks. So this includes the bioecological framework, the critical race theory, the integrative model, and then a few others. And so this model describes what racism is, that it has many forms and it will appear differently in different settings. And so let's start with cultural racism, which refers to a global perspective that reflects beliefs in the supremacy of one group over the other. And this belief is often rooted in people's views, their everyday behaviors, their language, their symbols, and also the media. So when we look at the media, we often see white people portrayed as beautiful, intelligent, and worthy, something that we all must aspire to. And so these varying perspectives has been the identity of the US, of this country, of this nation for the longest. And it also influences the dehumanization of Black and Brown people. And so we see and witness the dehumanization of Black and Brown people through institutional or systemic structural racism. And so institutional systemic racism includes policies and laws and practices that grant privileges to certain groups, but not others, despite being guaranteed to all within these institutions. So we can think of education, housing, employment, the criminal legal system. This model also speaks to this intergeneration effect of racism for children prior to and after their birth. So for example, as I've briefly talked about in a previous slide, the exposure to toxins and stress hormones in the utero can create a biological vulnerability, and then this could lead to social vulnerability, and it could follow a person throughout the life course. And then also thinking of social position variables. So considering race, ethnicity, age, gender, gender identity, and the sex of an individual when also thinking of these various systems of racism. Kimberly Crenshaw, who actually coined this term intersectionality, highlights the roles of power and inequity in the multiply marginalized intersecting identities and how these may vary among individuals and groups. So for example, how might internalized or interpersonal racism differ among Black girls versus Black boys? Or how might it differ among Black boys versus Latino boys? And then finally, in this model, we wanted to highlight this interplay between racism and cultural assets. So some cultural assets includes aspiration, resistance, and spirituality. And thinking of aspiration, we know that many Black and Brown families continue to stress the importance of education, even when those institutions continue to provide either insufficient funding or miseducation, or both. There's also the resistance piece as a cultural asset, which is the idea of standing up for justice for others from marginalized groups. Also, family capital, and this emphasizes that even when racist policies separate families, whether it be through imprisonment or immigration policies, Black and Brown families will create kinship bonds to strengthen their village. For example, in many Black families and communities, there are cousins and aunties and uncles that are not blood related. And I know that I have a lot of those. I also have a lot of sisters because in our community, we use sis as a term of endearment and to also convey this deep spiritual bond that is not blood related. And so given the pervasiveness of racism in the lives of REM children and families, it's important that we focus on preserving and protecting and promoting their health and well-being, along with protecting and promoting and preserving their culture, their heritage, and their identity, and their language as well. And so protection in this context is defined as the intentional sheltering from trauma and harm to a person's physical, emotional, and cultural identities. Protection from harm for Black and Brown children may look like dismantling this system and idea that Black and Brown children's bodies need to be policed and criminalized. There's also, then there's promotion, which is the idea that economically stable and emotionally sound and adequate access to basic resources will promote healthy outcomes for children and their families. For example, it's important that we address the disparities in early intervention and access to early intervention, and how Black children are often less likely to be referred to early intervention. And then when parents of color do raise any developmental concerns, it's often dismissed by providers and usually attributed to these social factors like poverty. And then when Black and Latin children do receive early intervention services, racial bias still shows up when we think of the quality of the services that they are receiving. And then there's preservation, which refers to preserving their language, their culture, and their identity. And so preserving these things look like instilling positive racial ethnic identity in REM children. So maybe it may be through cultural socialization messages. It could also be professional development training for practitioners and researchers and community leaders that is rooted in cultural responsiveness and humility, and also the preservation of practitioners of color. And so with all of this, where do we go from here? And given that we just addressed the 3 Ps of child and family well-being, I do want to start off with addressing the need for the passing of these policies. And so these 10 policies listed represent a step toward America fulfilling its promise to protect the full human rights of Black children and their families and their communities. And so we need to address the unfair discipline practices that REM children experience in school, and how that they are criminalized at as young as 3 years old. That is a problem. We need to change the language around REM children with disabilities so that they get equitable access to early intervention and special education. They are not violent. They may be dysregulated. And then removing them from the school grounds only tells them that they are not part of that community. And then finally, a song that we've been, singing for a while, we need to pass reparations. And so we can advocate for the passing of these policies, even in our own research. So there has been a movement for the longest to bridge the gap between research and policy. And I'm actually part of an organization called Research to Policy Collaboration at Penn State. And we're always looking for researchers to join our network as affiliates, who would share information with staffers and even meet with staffers on particular topics. So, if anyone is interested, I'd be happy to make that connection for you. And then going back to the RISE model, so we hope to see this framework integrated into more social developmental science work. Not only can this framework inform research, but it can also call attention to the need for more anti-racist practices and policies. So we hope that when folks think of ways to protect and promote and preserve the well-being of REM children and their families, that they also use this framework as a guide. The resilience and resistance piece are critical components because they highlight these family cultural assets that it often gets families of color through difficult racist experiences. For example, how enslaved Africans, they relied heavily on their God and their spiritual community to get them through the evilness and the atrocities of slavery. We also use resilience, though, with caution, because when Black folks have been called resilient, it often felt like a cop-out to addressing these various systems of racism that we've talked about today. So in this model, we call attention to all 3, that being racism, resilience, and resistance. And then lastly, moving forward, we do hope to see more equity-centered collaboration using anti-racist frameworks like this, and methodologies, and also dissemination, better dissemination. And so an equity-centered collaboration might look like community-based participatory research. It could also look like calling on researchers from other fields. And another that comes to mind is, no longer comparing REM children to white children in our research studies. That is getting old. We know that REM children are at risk for not reaching their full potential because of these systems of racism. So what are we going to do about it? And so what does racial equity look like in research? It may look like having an applied research agenda where there's a strengths-based approach that's being taken, and the stereotypes and the biases towards REM children and their families are being challenged. And also it can also deepen our understanding of their intersectional needs and experiences. And so an applied research approach is necessary because research historically has often depicted Black and Brown families as dysfunctional. And so racial equity in research is intersectional, it's asset-based, so that strengths-based approach. And then it's also culturally responsive. So thinking of questions like, who is doing the research? And might I also add cultural humility? So this practice of self-reflection and exploration and understanding that, even though we study these marginalized groups, we don't know everything. And we have to constantly be in the space of learning and unlearning. And then looking at the focus areas, so it's important that we also consider the context in which REM families occupy. And so this then requires researchers to focus on issues such as access to resources, quality of services and opportunities, and also justice in outcomes and results. All right, so let's talk about racial equity in practice for a moment. So here's what we may know. We know that REM children are vulnerable to harmful racist stereotypes, and they often internalize these stereotypes, and it impacts their racial identity development and also their self-esteem. And so there's a well-known study that tested this. So it was the Clark and Clark doll study, where Black babies were essentially having a preference for white dolls over Black dolls. We might also know that children who experience racism have higher rates of depression, anxiety, and behavioral problems. And so just as we are striving to engage in anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices in research, it's also important to engage in anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices in our practice. And so to engage in these, we have to develop an awareness of our prejudices. So this might include continuous education, reading, and some self-reflection. We also have to reflect on our implicit and explicit biases and messages that may have been learned about race, maybe through family, friends, or the media. And then we need to engage in active learning and unlearning. And we can likely do this through, attending workshops and trainings that are geared towards interrupting bias. And so I believe in my heart that there can never be too much trainings, as long as the ones that we're attending are, properly planned out with care and thought and action. Because with trainings, the training isn't what solves the problem. The work that we do after what we've learned in the trainings is where it all begins. And so these action steps are crucial as we move towards structural change and achieving equity for Black and Brown children. And so finally, here's the take-home message. If you remember nothing else today, I do want you to remember that racism is multidimensional, and it is ingrained in the DNA, the identity of the US. That attending to the 3 Ps of promoting and protecting and preserving the well-being of children and their families is crucial, given the pervasiveness of racism in their lives. And that our RISE model encourages researchers and practitioners to rise to the occasion of addressing civil and human rights issues. And so I usually do this at workshops and trainings, but I think it's equally fitting here. So I invite y'all to maybe take a picture or a screenshot of this slide and perhaps consider it a take-home activity or a journaling session. So this is a head, heart, and body exercise. And for head, you'll write down something you've learned today. For heart, you'll write down how you're feeling after this presentation. And then for body, you'll write down an action you're going to take coming out of this space. And so sometimes when we think of action, we tend to think big things, but we can make it very interpersonal or personal as well. So I'll just stay on this slide for a few seconds for folks to maybe take a picture or a screenshot. I guess I'll take a sip of water in the meantime. All right, so I just want to give acknowledgements to the Equity Research and Action Coalition at UNC Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute, where my mentor, Dr. Ioma Iruka, is the founding director. The researchers in investigating sociocultural equity and race, so Riser Network, where I was able to pull the report from and talk about COVID-19 and racism, the co-authors of the RISE article, and then also Dr. Ioma Iruka, who presented on these 3 Ps of protection, promotion, and preservation, so that I was able to share that information with you all. And then I just wanted to leave you all with resources, and I'll be sure to share this slide with the organizers of this webinar. And so the first link is the link to the ERAC, and then the Research to Policy collaboration at Penn State. And then there's an implicit bias training and education, and this is on Cox Campus. I actually really love Cox Campus because they have a lot of resources that are free and also trainings. And you can get continuing education credits through this. And then there are 2 upcoming webinars. You see a little $ because I think they were both under $35. And it's being led by researchers within this field. And then Dr. Kara Banks, who's also one of the moderators, she has a podcast, Raising Equity, lots of great episodes. And then with the RISE article and then the report, I'm happy to share that with anyone who may not have access. And then finally, to end my presentation, I do want to honor the Black children in my life. I do this work with them constantly on my mind. And so I do want to make this world a better place for them and for the children who look like them. So may they have long life and may their days be merry and bright. And Auntie Nicole, Cousin Nicole loves each and every one of you. Thank you all so much for being here. And I'm sorry that I'm not able to see folks in person or see your faces virtually, but I'm happy to stay in touch. So here are some of my social media handles, my website, and also my email. And I will turn it over to the moderators.
Thank you so much. I was looking for emojis. They don't have emojis on the webinars, but hand clap, very well done. You can't hear the round of applause that other people are doing. So yeah, I would love to engage in conversation. We have some questions. Just to remind you, you're welcome to ask questions and we will go through those.
We have one that started, but it looks like it might have cut off.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, check it out. If your question got cut off, go ahead and retype it up for us.
Yeah, so I mean, Annie, if you want to kick it off, you're welcome to, given that your prominence on the grant.
Oh, well, I just really appreciate you being here with us, Nicole, and sharing this model with us. You've done such a nice job of summarizing so much information. And so, you know, a lot stood out for me from the presentation. One of the things that stood out to me that I've been thinking about as a parent too, is that aspect of cyber racism. So you talked about, you know, racism being multidimensional. And so can you tell us more about cyber racism and what the research says about how it impacts teens specifically, so REM teens?
Yeah, so I briefly, or I know very little about cyber racism, and then there's also vicarious racism, so that indirect experience. But I do, from what I know of what the research says with cyber racism, is that it equally impacts the well-being of REM children. who experience, maybe being called slurs online, maybe through the various social media handles that they often use. It could even happen through media, so maybe what they watch. And so, yeah, from what I know, cyber racism is equally impacting the well-being and the health of young children.
And it seems like it could be maybe a constant, right? Because they're on social media so frequently.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And just thinking about some of the other dynamics, whether it's current events in society or that broader structural racism, in the system, that I'd be curious to see as we try to measure more of those experiences, the extent to which REM youth might be more exposed. And that actually links to one of the questions that I had, because you talk about and cite some research that talks about how these experiences of racism can be linked to depression and anxiety. But you also talk about, and we also have a body of research that says just because they're exposed doesn't mean they're negatively impacted. So we have these moderators and mediators. You talk about some of the cultural assets. And so it's not a totally bleak picture. And so wanted you to talk a little bit about what we know in terms of those cultural assets and how we can buffer young folks who are exposed, that it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to then be depressed or anxious.
Right. Yeah. So that's what we were hoping that the RISE model did highlight a lot, was the importance of these cultural assets and how they do serve as a protective buffer amid racism. And so we can think about, these strong family ties and how that helps REM children through difficult times. Also thinking of instilling racial ethnic pride. So when we think of cultural socialization messages, and what that may look like. So it could look like, being intentional about reading positive books that are centered on racial ethnic pride. So oftentimes when we think of Black and Brown families, it's often from a deficit-based approach and like highlighting the struggles. But for REM youth, it might be helpful to talk about amazing historical figures who are in their racial ethnic group. It could be taking them to cultural events like Juneteenth. I honestly didn't hear about Juneteenth until I think college, or know about Juneteenth. So things like these can help serve as a protective buffer. Yeah, thanks for asking that.
Yeah, I think it's really important because when I work with folks, they talk about quickly, because they are well-meaning, like, how do we talk to our kids about racism? And just like you said, I think it's really important that we bolster and promote their racial identity, preserve their racial identity, so that they have a sense of themselves and all of the P's that you mentioned before we talk about racism. So, right, like, you are a human being who matters. And that before we talk to them about how the system of racism negatively impacts them, we bolster their sense of self. We connect them with history, with their heritage, with the community. We make sure that they have resources, that their neighborhoods have resources. And so that really can protect them.
Yeah, I did a guest lecture on Tuesday in a child development course, and we talked about self-esteem, and I showed them a video of a psychologist who was talking with his child about how she feels when she's on social media and she sees images of people who fit in with like the Western ideology of what beauty looks like. And she said, sometimes it impacts my self-esteem, but then I think I'm pretty too. And this was because her dad and her mom were instilling racial ethnic pride in her, and consistently telling her, that she should be proud to be Black, and highlighting her beauties and her hair texture and all of these things. So it does help. It does.
Here and I were talking about this before, where oftentimes, parents are sharing that REM identity with their children. And so intuitively, you kind of know to bolster and promote before you talk about the negative, experiences they might encounter. But when I think about intersectionality, which you brought up, you don't always share that intersectional identity, other aspects of this intersectional identity with your children, like perhaps maybe gender identity or sexual orientation or neurodivergence. And
Mhm.
so I think, Kira, what you're saying here reminds me that that's a piece of doing that part first as well. And maybe you weren't thinking about that before because your child hadn't shared that part of their identity with you just yet. They didn't know it, they're developing. And so I think that sort of also highlights the need. And because we won't have that crystal ball, maybe the need of parents to just bolster all of these aspects of who children could grow into and make sure that they have that protection as they're getting older.
Yeah. I see a question in the question box. So Lene, your question, I think, is the one that got cut off. So if you want to put yours in, we'll come back to it. But Kimberly Annard, Dr. Annard asked, you mentioned that racism is associated with depression, anxiety, et cetera, in children. Are those conditions diagnosed in young children? Do those conditions persist in adulthood? And so I want to ask those who are the child psychologists can answer that best. And I also want to just name in context that this is similar to what we've seen debunked in terms of like trans and non-binary youth, that we hear, oh, they're at high risk for depression, anxiety, they're at high risk. And yet we also have research to show that when they have support in their network, they are not at increased risk. So that's the piece around helping to promote and shore up, because the problem isn't the youth. The problem is the environment that they're in and that they're experiencing this discrimination that leads to these distress symptoms. And so, not that Kimberly was asking this at all. I just think it's really important that even as we talk about whether this is diagnosed in young folks, that we see them in context and that we not locate the problem to be solved in the youth, that we really have to look at them in the context that they're in.
Yeah. That's a great point, Kira. And to answer that specific question as a clinical psychologist, I would say that yes, we can diagnose young children, and they can experience depression and anxiety in preschool years even. And so it takes careful assessment and long-term sort of follow-up to really understand what's happening. Regardless of what the diagnosis is, I think the recommendation would be the same, which is to, provide positive social supports around that child. And sort of, I envision building the bubble of protection around the child, social connection, and just what you talked about, Nicole, the community connection, other adults in the community who see and value the child. So yeah, that's a great question. Let's see.
Another question that's in the question box. Let's see. Any tips on your personal experience for effectively advocating for policy solutions, given the inevitable backlash in political climate?
So I can speak from, my personal experience with being in the research to policy collaboration at Penn State. And so this was helpful because it was, I wasn't necessarily in the policy space, but I was connected to it through staffers and offices. And so there were staffers who were interested in these equity and justice-centered questions. And so they would often send these questions to our network on how do we improve the well-being of children of color in schools? How did COVID-19 impact the well-being of children? So they were interested in these questions, and we were able to within our research network, we were able to answer those questions for them, and even meet with them to discuss more about it. So there you are right in that there is like much tension in the political climate, but I think I am often hopeful because there are people within this policy space who are interested in these same questions that we have been researching.
And I would agree. I think that we should not shy away from having the conversation simply because there will be backlash. Mm-hmm. That sometimes the backlash can be really loud to keep folks from being willing to even put the conversation forward. And so my thoughts around like moving forward with DEI work amidst the backlash is to keep it very research-based. Like, we know that these conversations about race and racism with kids, understanding them in context, is a way to protect them. And so if we're going to be talking about policy that makes sure that they have healthcare and adequate education, it is simply one more aspect of their lives that's worth our time. And so I often will try to look for shared commonality. So we care about kids, we can have this conversation, and rather than assume adversarial or antagonistic interactions.
Yep.
We have Lene's question up now, and it's, I think, related to, sort of struggling with how to address these issues in this time. So she's asking, how can educators try to interrupt some of these cultural and racially insensitive practices while trying to keep their job? And Lene is an educator.
Yes, that's my aunt. Yeah, I mean, this is tough. I think from I'll speak directly to my aunt. I know that she has often opened up her office to many youth of color who have expressed, struggling with a particular thing. And I think, just starting there, opening up your office and providing that space for them to share any challenges that may arise for them, because when we think of how difficult it might be for some youth to share because of these power dynamics that exist and because of these multiply marginalized social identities, they often look for safety nets. And so I think it's starting there is important, just creating a safety net for them to share, and just that safety net to share.
Yeah, I think there's research that I teach in my lifespan class. It was a longitudinal study following children in Hawaii, I believe, who were from low SES background, low socioeconomic background. And what they found was that having one adult outside of your family who cared about you, who supported you, was one of the factors that really helped these youth develop resilience and achieve and overcome a lot of the risk that they were at. So I would agree with your answer, Nicole, that just be there as a supportive adult.
And I would also say you can partner. Like, as a teacher, if you have tenure at a school, you might have influence among the administration. And so you can get cover. If you know of a researcher who you could bring to the school to talk about these issues, which you do, right? Like, how can you get the school to invite that person so that you don't have to be the one saying what needs to be said, but you partner and have the school engage in that sort of programming. Also thinking about partnering with parents. There might be parents who want to, through the PTO or PTA, do this sort of work. And so I've done work in schools, and it's great when the school district can give teachers the kind of green light and signal in a way that they support, that gives them a lot more freedom than when they are feeling like they're the lone wolf on this crusade. And just also to name for folks who are here, if you go to the Q&A, there's some questions that we have answered in text, and there's some folks who've shared some resources and some sentiments there. So don't hesitate to go there and look at the answered questions as well.
Yeah. We have another question here. So thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Nicole. You said racism is multidimensional. I wonder how this definition leads to reshapes or updates conceptualizations about trauma and resilience.
Could you hear that, Nicole?
You were going.
It went in and out a bit.
Did I go in and out?
Yeah, I think if you come closer to your computer, I think as you turned your head, it went out.
It's hard. Okay, let me move over here. Okay, so they are wondering how the definition of multidimensional racism leads to or reshapes or updates our conceptualizations about trauma and resilience.
I'm trying to follow the question.
Yeah, I think maybe I think one thing that stands out about this question was something that you mentioned, which was that we caution the over reliance on resilience, maybe.
Okay.
And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So when I said that, we should use resilience with caution, it was to make note that, when Black and Brown people are usually called resilient, we leave it at that, like, oh yeah, they're resilient, they're doing well, they're doing great. And it makes a lot of folks feel like there's no more need to continue to work on the problem.
Mhm.
So it's important that we highlight their resilience, our resilience and our resistance through these cultural assets, but we should be careful about using that word, especially when we're trying to move toward structural equity and change for Black and Brown families.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think this actually relates to something that someone else shared. It's like not using resilience as, like you said, as a reason to not do the structural work. Oh, because they're resilient, right? But they shouldn't have to be. So because a kid has been able to jump through all these hoops to end up being in this space that maybe you didn't think that they would, given where they came from. We often tell those stories in our society as if they are success stories, when if we're really taking care of children, they wouldn't have had to struggle and suffer and be in those systems that didn't support them. And so someone mentioned in the chat that they were, someone posted a picture from grade school and their yearbook, and they looked at the pictures and saw their bullies and their tormentors. They realized that their parents had shielded them from a lot of racism or buffered it. And they realized that it was something in their life that they didn't buy into, and that bullying did not achieve its desired result. Like they weren't able to bully them. And it speaks to some of what you talked about in terms of parents being racially socializing their children in a way that buffers them. And it also speaks to a question I have. This is a big question. I'm linking it. You all talk about internalized racism as if it's inside the child. And one of the concepts that I've been thinking a lot about is appropriated racism rather than internalized, that rather than being in a child, it's something that they pick up. It's like myths and lies and stories that these systems tell them about who they are, and they don't actually have to have them inside them. And this person's comment to me makes me think that their parents did enough buffering and racial socialization in a particular way that they didn't internalize those negative stories and that they didn't impact them.
Yeah. You actually made me change my language around that when I was listening to your one of the episodes of how I think it was you that you were talking to your son and said about a white girl who said something to him, and you said, I don't know where she picked it up, but I do hope she puts it back down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's made me think a lot, like raising kids harder than my PhD. Made me think a lot about, like, we study these variables, but like, what does it look like in real time? And so as the models come out about like how we navigate racism, I think I've been more sensitive about this idea that we internalize the racism rather than like, it is something that is outside of us.
Yeah.
That we can pick up or not. And that I don't know that I want us to accept that it's in us, because I don't think it starts in us, and I don't think we have to have it in us. Maybe that's the hopeful part of me.
Yeah.
And we've talked a lot about, what parents of REM kids do to protect and buffer. And I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to what white parents can do to socialize their white children to fight against racism.
Yeah, so there's a lot of research that says that, white parents tend to engage in color evasive messages. And this is more commonly known as colorblind, but I refrain from using that because it's an ableist language. But they tend to engage in these color evasive messages. And so these messages can include statements like, we don't see color, or everyone is equal. And so they think that when they do this, they're engaging in anti-racist practice and they're raising anti-racist children. But, there's lots of research that says that it actually does more harm than good. when they do engage in these messages, because when they do, white parents are actually minimizing, this pervasiveness of racism and the evilness of racism. And then, white parents, when they are silent about race and racism, there's this assumption that it's because they don't have race and that only people of color are racialized and assigned a race. I do think it's important that, white parents talk to their children about race, not just about how people of color are discriminated against, but also about how white people and families benefit from the various systems of whiteness and racism that marginalizes people of color. And with children, I know, children's books are always helpful. And so I think there's a lot of books I see coming out as it relates to, raising anti-racist children. And I was actually, so with my postdoc, I usually observe classrooms and we have to look for diverse books. And I actually saw one that was related to like this theme of raising anti-racist children. And I think it was like Juneteenth for Musa. It was like a child's name, but it was a Juneteenth for Maisie is what it was called. And I thought it was a beautiful book to keep in the class, to also expose children and white children to what race and racism and what the cultural identities and heritage and beliefs of Black and Brown people look like.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, I think about the kinds of history that's taught in schools, which we know is a hot topic right now. And that's what's so dangerous about that, because if we, for a long time, the only history that was taught was the, history that focused on a very specific time and a very, sort of deficit-based approach to looking at Black folks and Indigenous folks. And now we don't even want to talk about that. So now no history will be discussed. And the importance of talking about sort of the whole history, including positive aspects and, contributions that REM folks have made to this country. So,
Yeah.
And just like we were talking about appropriated racism and how REM kids can pick up the lies and negative things that society tells them about themselves, white children pick up the stories and the narratives that they're better.
Mm-hmm.
And if as a white parent, you don't see that, to start to be curious how those messages get portrayed, whether it's what gets centered. I have two kids who identify as boys, and we would watch shows and I would ask them what other Black and brown kids are on the show. I would ask specifically what other Black and brown boys are on the show. And oftentimes they were absent. And if I would specifically say Black boys, they were the sidekicks. They were the funny ones. They weren't serious. They didn't do well in school. Like, it was these narratives, right? Negative narratives. So on the flip side, for white parents, look at the shows that your kids are watching and ask yourself, what are the messages that they're getting? That their stories get to be centered, that they're as young girls, they're the ones that are desired and beautiful. There's all sorts of messages. And so that's also a way as a white parent that you can start to see, like, oh, how do I, of course, you're not going to say like, you're not beautiful, but you want to make sure that they know that the way in which they are portrayed as beautiful, that there are other ways to be beautiful. Like, so it could be you affirming a brown girl with their curly natural hair. Like, you want to interrupt, like, we want to see that there are other ways to be beautiful. All the shows that you're watching, the girls are looking the same, wearing their hair the same or whatever, like, to be curious about that, to interrupt it. So I think white parents have a lot to work with to notice those superiority messages.
Yeah, I think there are, and I've noticed this with children now myself, there are many more shows than when I was growing up that are doing that. And so those shows are not just for Black kids, they're for all kids. And that's an opportunity to watch those shows with your children and say something about how beautiful the character's hair is or her skin, or, so I think, yeah, those shows are for your kids too.
Yep.
Are we running out of time, Kira?
I think, what time, Katie?
6:35.
6:35. Oh, it's 5:35 right now.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. So there's a question about assessment measures, questionnaires, structured interviews that are available that might help assess the variables the webinar is discussing. This person works with children as a neuropsychologist. Any assessment measures folks would recommend? I have thoughts, but I'll let someone else go first. Or I will while y'all are thinking. of stuff.
What I wonder, do you know, Kira, what variables do you think they're talking about?
So I don't know, but broadly,
Let's guess. Yeah.
like, let's go broad. And so this is where I wasn't going to go first, because I would suggest not as like part of a neuropsych assessment to diagnose a child in a way that we might traditionally think of for neuropsych, but to understand them in context. I think using a racial and ethnic identity measure model would help you understand who they are. If you're trying to understand something about the family, there are measures of racial socialization to perhaps prompt a conversation and a dialogue. So they're not diagnostic assessment tools in the way that a neuropsych assessment is traditionally thought of, but it can help you understand who you're assessing.
Yeah, I think that reminds me of the DSM-5's interviews at the end of the DSM-5 cultural interviews that you could use. And those, there's interviews that you can use with children and adolescents specifically, and then interviews that you could use with parents. And I think, yes, Kira, it gives you a sense of what is their conceptualization of their own identity. And I think that's really important. So often we're sort of making an assumption of how folks identify. So we might see them and think they're Black, but maybe they identify as, Caribbean, or, so we need to really understand who they are and what context they're coming from. It asks questions about their name and how their name was chosen, and that'll help you understand the family better. It asks questions about extended kinship, which Nicole highlighted how important that is. So I would recommend using that DSM-5 cultural interview formulation tools in the back of the DSM.
And I also think someone said the terms can be difficult to address with family and friends who are not so well knowledgeable or enlightened. For those of you who are clinicians or teachers or practitioners, I really encourage you to get comfortable having the conversation and prompting the conversation, even when other people are uncomfortable, which means you might have to be really patient. And folks might not use the right terms, right? Like it might not feel comfortable, but it's important. Like you're reminding me, Annie, of a case I supervised. It was a educational, an assessment, a neuropsych assessment. And it was super important that we understood this young girl, young Black girl who his mom had put her in, mom taught in a predominantly Black school in the city, had put the child in a predominantly white school in the county because she was like, this is a better education. But daily, the child was being treated as if she was not intelligent, her behavior, which was very precocious, was not seen as, oh, look at this precocious child, but negatively, kind of like Nicole talked about, the behavior being labeled. And so here the school is saying, assess this child, she needs accommodations. And it's like, actually, she's not, that's not the issue. There are the accommodations she needs are for you to respect her as a little Black girl. And so we wouldn't have understood that if we would only done the traditional neuropsych assessment pieces and not had the interview and the conversation.
Yeah. I think that just being curious, asking those questions of the family, asking those questions of the family in terms of like, what's their perception of what's happening at school? How do they feel that their child is being treated at school? Are they being treated fairly? And then don't be afraid to include those recommendations in the report. I know I consulted with you, Kira, before about this and asked for recommendations for culturally sensitive and inclusive teaching practices. And I included it in the report. And to be honest, the very first time I did that, I was a little nervous, like, ooh, how's this going to go over? But the school was pretty open to it. And it went really well. They were happy to be given something to work with. So don't be afraid.
Yep.
Yeah, that's important for me to hear as someone who is in clinical practice, but in a different way. So with doing psychological assessments with young children, and just being mindful of the different needs of children of color, and why it's important to be mindful of the resources that are being shared as it relates to the specific needs, so that it does tie into that equity part of being mindful of these specific individual needs of these families. So thank you for saying that.
We have a question about trauma-informed practices. The use of trauma-informed practices related to this discussion. I have kind of a strong reaction to that, but I will.
For it.
Just because I think that similar to how you talk about resilience being overused and over-relied upon, I think we overuse and over-rely upon the framing of trauma-informed practices. And so how does this relate to the discussion? It is related, but I see trauma-informed practices and restorative practices under a broader umbrella of healing justice work. And healing justice work would say, we want to help and heal the harm from oppression, and we are also actively working to stop the harm. I think too often people use trauma-informed practices to help those who are harmed and then stop the conversation. Like, we've done the work to help and then like not try to stop the continued harm. That people have used it to get off the hook. So I would say we need to think about it under that broader umbrella of healing justice work that calls us to actually stop the harm.
I think the other concern I have with trauma informed is that it because the way I was taught trauma informed practices was that it was very specific to the individual, right? It goes back to, you know, let's fix the person. Let's fix this child who's been traumatized. But again, if we're thinking in the framework that you presented to us, there's nothing wrong with this child. It's the context that this child finds themselves in. It's the racism that is surrounding this child. And that's what we need to address.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, I really hate to cut off this conversation because I have more questions, and I was thinking about in my work in family science and some of our some of my colleagues who study Black families and couples, and so my brain's going wild now, and I'm just so grateful for this conversation and getting to kind of listen in, right, and hear about where you all are headed. Thank you, Dr. Nicole Telfer, for being here. For zooming in and filling this Zoom room, I don't know, in our region with your insights and introducing this model to us. I so appreciate your time. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, so thank you all for having me. It's a lovely discussion to be part of.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to our attendees. This is recorded, so after this, you will get a link. You're welcome to watch it again, share with colleagues. We hope this makes a difference in your work. Thank you, Kira and Annie, for being here, and we will see you all another time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.